Hello, I'm Barry Kern, CEO of Kern Studios and Mardi Gras World. For over 90 years, my family's been bringing Mardi Gras to the world. We're proud to sponsor the Historic New Orleans Collection's new exhibition, Making Mardi Gras. This exhibition and programs celebrate the artists and makers who make Mardi Gras so spectacular. Enjoy the program and happy Mardi Gras.
We are opening the symposium with a deep look at the origins of Mardi Gras in New Orleans and how it was made from the ground up. Historian and author Rien Fertel is joined by Lydia Blackmore, the Historic New Orleans Collection's Making Mardi Gras exhibition curator, to explore the first 101 years of Carnival. From the flambeaux lighting the Mistick Krewe of Comus parade in 1857 to the Krewe of Yuga a century later, Fertel looks at the marginalized groups that were key to making Mardi Gras we know it today. Enjoy the program and welcome to the symposium. And remember, everywhere else, it's just Tuesday.
Thanks, Arthur. I'm Lydia. I'm the curator of the exhibition Making Mardi Gras, and I'm here on Zoom with Rien Fertel to talk about some Mardi Gras history. Thanks for being here, Rien.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so what is the beginning of New Orleans Mardi Gras? Where are we starting?
So we're starting, at least for the purposes of this talk, when we're talking about the origins of Mardi Gras or the beginnings of modern Mardi Gras, we got to start in 1857. That is the year most commonly given. 1857 is when the Mistick Krewe of Comus forms. Mistick Krewe of Comus, a group of men get together. They meet in one of kind of their businesses, and they decide that Mardi Gras, that carnival celebrations, these pre-Lenten celebrations in New Orleans, needs to be reimagined, needs to be reformed. And what they decide, or what they think about, Mardi Gras at that point, is that Mardi Gras is a little too loose, is a little too chaotic, and they want to organize Mardi Gras, and they want to organize Mardi Gras around a parade. And, for anyone who has been to a Mardi Gras parade on the streets of St. Charles or Canal or Broad Street, we would recognize, what happened that year. Mardi Gras before was, it is true, a unorganized, perhaps chaotic street celebration. And it's like that throughout the carnival celebrating globe, right? The world, wherever people celebrate Mardi Gras, people celebrate Mardi Gras usually in a very unorganized fashion. Kind of the primary, ethos, right, or theme of Mardi Gras and carnival in, Catholic worshiping nations, going back to ancient Rome and now throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. One of the primary themes of carnival is a rite of reversal, right? And rite of reversal means just what it says, is that this is a time, this is a moment for inverting, for exaggerating. Masking, for example, is a rite of reversal. Your face literally becomes not your face. Costuming is a rite of reversal. Your body, your literal corpus, becomes not your body, right? It becomes different. And the rite of reversal traditionally that carnival provides is the opportunity to criticize, to poke fun at those who are more powerful than yourself. When we punch up, we punch up against politicians. So if you've been to Krewe de Vue, you're very familiar with this. We punch up against the patriarchy often during carnival season, or we just punch up against anyone higher up the social ladder. This punching up during Carnival allows the powerless to seize power by making fun of, by satirizing power itself. And going back to Comus, I mean, why Comus was reactionary, it not only changed this punching up, but it started punching down, as I think we'll discuss later on. But Comus itself was a private organization that inspired other private carnival organizations, parading during what was always seen as a very public holiday. And Comus and a lot of the carnival crews that followed, they centered their celebrations around themes of privilege, around themes of wealth, and whiteness. And when we talk about whiteness in Mardi Gras, we have to talk about white supremacy.
So then what were they reacting against?
So they were reacting against all the changes that were going on in New Orleans and Louisiana, in the nation at the time. So this is we're building up to the Civil War, right? So the Civil War happens a decade after the founding of the new or modern Mardi Gras. The Civil War didn't engender all of these changes. All of these changes are ramping up. They're in the air. Notions of the end of slavery, notions of incorporating the South into the body politic that is the United States in a truer fashion. All of these things were being talked about, and Mardi Gras was one of many kind of cultural as well as political and social reactionary movements from the era.
Mm-hmm. So Comus started in 1858.
56, yeah. So 1850.
Comus started in 1856, and then that's followed by the other big names that have been recognized: Momus, Rex, and Proteus. These crews are often called like the golden age of Carnival. Was it really golden?
No, I mean, the golden age is never golden when we talk about the golden age, right? So when we talk about the golden age, we're talking about, a romanticization of an age. And what was Mardi Gras was being defined during this period. It was new. It was no doubt exciting. It was no doubt a fun time for the individuals involved. But when we talk about this golden age, we also have to talk about the violence and oppression that was being done to Black people in this city. And often this violence and oppression was going hand in hand with Carnival celebrations itself. And there's plenty of examples of this. I mean, we know, if you're at all a Carnival in New Orleans buff, you likely know about the Comus Parade of 1873, which is certainly the most infamous example of Mardi Gras' often reactionary, unreconstructed, and frequently racist early history. The theme of the Comus Parade of 1873, if you don't know, is the missing links to Darwin's Origin of Species. And you can go and Google these images or look at them in the archive of the Historic New Orleans collection, where some of them are housed. And we could look at the costume designs from that parade in 1873. We could look at Comus's very hideous caricatures of Black people. These caricatures, these costumes marched in the streets of New Orleans that year. And so when we talk about Mardi Gras, we need to talk about that, but we also need to talk about the very reactionary, violent movements that often happened immediately after Carnival celebrations. So we can talk about, and these basically just fit under the heading of race riots in the history of New Orleans. I mean, the New Orleans Massacre of 1866 started out as a peaceful demonstration of Black freedmen. It ended when this peaceful demonstration of men was attacked by a mob of white rioters under the guidance of a man named Henry Hayes, who was a former Confederate general. He was a sheriff of New Orleans, and he was the president at the time of the Pickwick Club, which was the organization behind the Mistick Krewe of Comus. That event, the massacre, is called the massacre because 200 Black men were murdered in the streets of the city. And the following year, 1867, Hayes appears on a Comus float in a robe, mask, and hood, echoing the uniform of the Ku Klux Klan and other white paramilitary organizations from the period. And going forward into today, that has become kind of like a standard carnival uniform for several crews with minor adjustments. But, to look at these pictures side by side is it's not hiding much, I should say. And there's other examples from the era. There was the Battle of Liberty Place, 1874, which was a literal political insurrection and coup that involved the participation of over 100 Comus members. Comus's official historian would write about this event decades later, and he would say, and this is a quote, I'm just gonna read it. He would say, "It's safe to say that every member capable of bearing arms participated that day." And this coup was against a liberal democratic elected government in the city of New Orleans, right? It was a pushback against Reconstruction. And one more example, 1877, the year Reconstruction ended with the removal of federal troops from the city, Comus's theme, Comus marched in the streets of New Orleans that year under the banner of the Aryan race. That was their theme. And so when we talk about Mardi Gras, when we talk about we must talk, I would argue, about the systematic violence and oppression enacted on Black lives. And I think, the theme of my, my talk today, or the notes are prepared, is also how people pushed back against that, right? How people pushed back against those reactionary policies, and what cultures came out of that pushback.
Who was reacting against those reactionaries?
Yeah, I mean, if we place all the origins of every single kind of organization and carnival group on a timeline, we can see a lot of what comes next, post 1870s as a reaction against that, reaction. And these were individuals, these were organizations, these were groups, these were men and women who rewrote the rules of Mardi Gras, who fought for inclusion, who while often, it should be said, they're fighting for inclusion while still being excluded from the center of Carnival itself, still often being excluded from public streets. And it should also be said, and that a lot of these groups were exclusionary themselves, right? So they were exclusionary in the sense that these new groups, these new carnival organizations, were organized along lines of race, along lines of gender, along lines of sexual orientation, much like Comus itself, but in a reaction to Comus and the parading culture of that quote unquote golden age of Mardi Gras. So they were exclusionary in the sense that not everyone could join. So they were unmaking Mardi Gras while remaking Mardi Gras anew. It should be said that this constant remaking of Mardi Gras gets at the heart, the foundation of what Carnival is itself, is that it's farewell to the flesh, it's a farewell to the old, it's throwing out whatever needs to be thrown out and creating something brand new.
So the first century of Mardi Gras is still more and more people are finding their way in, but it's still very siloed, right? Everybody has their own way of doing things. So you talked a lot about the rich white men. What were the other people doing? Was there women fighting the patriarchy going on in early Carnival?
Yeah, there was. And before I'll talk about women in a moment, but I should talk, if I want to follow the timeline, the history of New Orleans, we should talk about the Mardi Gras Indians or the origins of Black masking culture in New Orleans. And
so who came first, Comus or Indians?
So historians differ on this. So we have we could pinpoint on that timeline the origins of Comus, the origins of modern Mardi Gras. The Mardi Gras Indians is a little harder. Black masking culture didn't start with the Mardi Gras Indians. I don't like to pick a historical side, I should say, in when the Mardi Gras Indians came about. There's different historians have different opinions on this. One being, which was once the leading opinion, now maybe the least popular opinion, is that the Mardi Gras Indians originated in 1884, 1885, after being inspired by Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. That's mostly been thrown out. There's some Indians themselves date themselves earlier to just the early 1880s. So before Buffalo Bill and his Wild West show came to New Orleans, and they say that a big chief, a chief named Bacate Baptiste, started the Creole Wild West before Buffalo Bill. And then, historians have been digging up sources that kind of from decades earlier that point to their accounts of Mardi Gras Indian-esque or type dances and costumes, certainly derived from West African and Caribbean cultures that are going on in Congo Square. This is going back to the early decades of the 19th century, the 1800s. So I don't want to pick a side in this fight. One of my favorite quotes on this fight is from Larry Bannock, who's big chief of the Golden Star Hunters. And he says, nobody ain't going to find the code, meaning that like no one is going to find the true origins of the culture and tradition. But I think when talking about the Mardi Gras Indians and when talking about Black masking traditions and cultures in the city, we need to think of these as one historian calls them, hidden forms of resistance, right? We can talk about how the Indians played with history, how they fought to parade on public streets that were both during the carnival season and not treated as private streets owned by the city's white citizenry. And I think it's important to acknowledge, to recognize that Black masking Indians know their history today, and they knew their history back in the 1880s. They knew that Black bodies were not welcome on the streets during Carnival. They knew how to read the streets. They would recognize that Blackface was the most popular costume among white Carnival revelers in the 1870s and 1880s, when they first began masking with, or at least in a more organized sense, masking and wearing feathers. And just one note on that, just one historical kind of statistic I found. In 1872, one local newspaper estimated that 75% of costume carnival goers, so this is white costume carnival goers, were masked in blackface. 75% of people. Indians knew this. They recognized it. They could read the streets. Indians, Mardi Gras Indians, are the men and women who organized these groups. They knew that Indian costumes were also immensely popular during Carnival. They knew that Indian costumes and Indian themes were frequent themes on Mardi Gras floats during Comus and Rex. The Indians also likely knew their deeper history and the deeper history of the city and of Carnival in the city. They knew that during the Spanish colonial era, masking and public dancing by Black people was outright banned, was outlawed. And so by putting on a mask, by wearing beads and feathers, is no doubt hearkening back to transatlantic traditions, but also to a deeper history here in New Orleans and pushing back or fighting against that often exclusionary history.
Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to fast forward us out of the 1880s.
And you asked about women, right? So
yes, I was going to say, so who are Mardi Gras Indians? Are they mostly men? Are they mostly women? They're obviously mostly African American, or maybe mixed race. Where are the women?
The Mardi Gras Indian gangs, today they're made up of men, women, kids, families. It's a Black tradition in the city. And another Black masking tradition, a carnival tradition in the city, were the baby dolls. The baby dolls come a little later, and we can actually kind of date the baby dolls. We could put a date on that timeline. 1912 And a lot of what we know about the baby dolls is really due to this like amazing work that's been done recently by Kim Vaz-DeVille. And she's written a couple books on the subject, and they're totally worth picking up and reading. And they talk about the long history of the baby dolls, and also kind of the more recent history of the baby dolls, and have plenty of oral histories with the baby dolls. The baby dolls are basically, they're a group of women who were formed out of racial segregation within the sex trade. These were sex workers in the early 1900s, and they dressed up in costumes they called baby doll outfits, right? Costumes were like overtly sexualized too, right? And so, Kim Vaz-DeVille like makes the case that these baby dolls weren't just like women fighting to participate, in a carnival that up until then was not very welcome to the public parading and presentation of women on the streets of New Orleans. I mean, before, we got to remember, I mean, this is like also the golden age of carnival balls. And this is, a queen might be allowed to ride on a float, but, the queens and her maids were, that was a very private affair where they were kept, right, in their gowns and their finery. That was that was members only. And here we have a group of women who are publicly presenting on the streets of New Orleans in a very sexualized way. They are also Black women. And Kim Vaz-DeVille has this amazing quote. She says, these women who are really, we can think of as the first women, to create a parading culture or a carnival culture on the streets of New Orleans, that it was all about asserting one's personhood. And that's what the baby dolls did. And they've been kind of like reformed and re-energized more recently post Katrina. And it's all about asserting personhood.
Yeah, the baby dolls were really the first women on the streets, as you were saying, because queens didn't ride in parades until the Zulu queens started riding in the late 30s, and right. There wasn't a female parading crew until the 40s. So it really was the baby dolls who were the first women out in the streets. You mentioned blackface, and today there's still people who parade in blackface today, but they're not the people who wore blackface back then. How does Zulu play into this?
Okay, so we're talking about Zulu. So, so the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club is like infinitely fascinating. They organized a club. They named themselves the Tramps. Then in 1909, a handful of these tramps went out for a night on the town. They went to a downtown theater to see a musical comedy performed by a touring company called the Smart Set. It's touring around the United States. And this performance group, the Smart Set, was one of the few examples of well, I shouldn't say few examples. It was an example of Black performers performing in blackface for a Black audience. And that night, their comedy routine included a skit entitled "There Never Was and There Will Never Be a King Like Me," in which the performers in blackface also wore grass skirts. And the performers called themselves that night in the skit, in this comedy skit, they called themselves the Zulus, after the Zulu ethnic group of the nation of South Africa, right? And Zulu at the time was also a popular pejorative to refer to the entirety of the African continent as a savage place. This is like very kind of like darkest Africa, theme stuff going on. But this is for a Black audience, and the Tramps in the audience that night loved what they saw. They ran with the idea. They changed their name to Zulu. They started dressing similarly that same year for Mardi Gras, and they paraded in Mardi Gras in grass skirts. And scholar Felipe Smith wrote this really great essay you can find online about Zulu and Zulu history. And he says that the early Zulus simultaneously dressed up and dressed down. And the Historic New Orleans collection has this great photo from 1940 of the royal court, where the Zulus, there's, a handful of men, and they're dressed in both like black turtleneck shirts, like very plain, but also gaudy royal robes. They're wearing grass skirts, they're wearing blackface paint. They have rhinestone crowns, right? So kind of like dressing up, and they have scepters, but these scepters are themselves dressed down. It's a banana stalk scepter. So, all of this, why were the Zulus doing this? Were they, just participating in this, long racist history of blackface in the United States? And the answer is no. I mean, this was all an attempt to poke fun at a local carnival culture that would not have them as members. And their use of blackface not only satirized, but deconstructed nearly a century of blackface minstrelsy culture in the US. But it also reclaimed the display of blackness, which, as I gave in the stat before, was so popular on the streets among white costumed revelers. And furthermore, I mean, to add to the satire that they were piling on, the Zulus marched on all important Mardi Gras Day, right? Before the Krewe of Rex, the quote unquote king of Mardi Gras, king of Carnival. In their early years, the Zulus' parades were purposely chaotic. The routes were meandering, and this was all a satirical poke in the eye of Carnival's pomposity. And eventually they transformed what was a small walking parade into a larger parade with floats. But still, their floats would, it had one of the floats was for frying fish. It was like a mobile kitchen, right? So it was still kind of like taking this whole carnival culture that was now decades long. It was punching up, right? And I should also say, that was only one facet of Carnival. In 1916, which was the kind of like, this was the 1915, 1916, Zulu is really transforming. They're building their membership. This is when they start parading with actual floats and transform from the walking crew they were before. And they incorporate in 1916 as a benevolent society, the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club, we know them as. And they provided, just like many Black mutual aid societies in the city, they provided health services for people, burial insurance for families, for Black New Orleanians. And, they were all for the public good before the public good was something that a lot of other crews have, promoted themselves as doing.
This seems like very elaborate satire. Did everybody get the satire, and did it continue being funny?
Well, no. I mean, because some people today, and there's op-eds, there's articles in the New York Times and elsewhere, meaning, and also, of course, in what remains of our local media, there's all types of voices arguing that blackface is not funny, right? And blackface has never been funny. And then, of course, you have a bunch of defenders of Zulu. And I think maybe kind of like the most important decade in the history of the organization was not when it was founded in the early 1900s, but the 1950s and 60s. And this is, of course, this is the civil rights era. We are deep in the civil rights movement in the South when what happens. And what happens is a lot of these both local and national civil rights organizations started targeting the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club for their blackface. I mean, they targeted Zulu. They saw Zulu as part of what was then the very segregated, very structural Jim Crow racism in this country. And following the boycott of and protesting of segregated white-owned businesses throughout the city, something that happened, of course, throughout cities all over the South and all over the nation, Carnival became a major civil rights target. And social aid and pleasure clubs, Black organizations throughout the city were enlisted to encourage their members to boycott Mardi Gras, to boycott Carnival. And members of Zulu initially voted internally to join the movement and to not march on Mardi Gras Day 1961. But just weeks before they were to march or would have marched, the city's mayor, Shep Morrison, and the city's police chief, they go to Zulu's headquarters. probably for the first time in their lives on Broad Street. And they basically strong-armed the club into rolling that year. And, as Felipe Smith, who I mentioned before in his history of the Zulus, he mentions, he says it was both ironic and more than a little awful that in his words, Zulu paraded in defiance of the Civil Rights Coalition under the protection of armed white policemen, accompanied by the dogs, this is on the parade route, accompanied by the dogs that had been trained to attack Black citizens and break up civil rights demonstrations. And so what happens is that this decision by Zulu in 1961 is hated. And the response is a massive boycott, a petition signed by 27,000 members of the city's Black community, signed by Black-owned businesses, signed by Black ministers in the city, signed by Black high schools in the city, a petition that condemns Zulu for betraying the civil rights cause and for its continuation of blackface. And this petition was published in all the newspapers, and they called this the petition called it a fight for dignity. They resent and repudiate the Zulu parade, they said, and they said they petition all citizens of New Orleans to avoid future Zulu parades. And what ultimately happens is the Zulu membership collapses. It dips to just 16 members. And this figure I got is from the organization's official history on their website. It causes a massive rift within the organization. And Zulu eventually surrenders the use of blackface. This surrender only lasts for a few years. They finally bring it back in 1967. But I think it's a history worth remembering when or a period worth remembering and a fight worth remembering when we have these discussions for and against a blackface in the Zulu tradition.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I did not know all of that about Zulu. I knew that they had lost almost all of their members, but I didn't quite realize the extent of that controversy. Were there any other, huge civil rights battles played out in Carnival?
Yeah, my favorite one, when I first started getting interested in the history of Carnival, it was through the Flambeaux. I was always just enthralled by the Flambeaux as a kid when I'd attend. I grew up in Lafayette, and when I'd come to New Orleans for parading weekends, I'd go to parades with my grandmother, and I just loved the Flambeaux. And I think kids love the Flambeaux, right? It's fire, and you get to interact with them in ways that maybe you don't otherwise. So instead of begging for beads, if you are over the age of, say, I don't know, if you're over the age of 30, you might remember throwing coins to Flambeau and having these men who carry these lighted torches that light up the parade route, chasing after these quarters, nickels, and dimes that are, rolling down the street. Now, of course, we hand dollar bills or change to the Flambeau. So I spent a couple years kind of interviewing, doing oral histories with longtime Flambeau carriers. And what I learned is that the Flambeau tradition is a tradition, and it's a tradition in the best sense of a word. It involves lineages, often family lineages, where men and the Flambeau are still, was originally a culture of men carrying these torches. Now it is, it has diversified in terms of gender, for sure. It's integrated. But, these men literally pass the torch onto their sons and grandsons and nephews. And it's something that they do every year and have done every year and will do for decades and have done for decades and get very excited about, right? It's not just, I think, how I certainly saw it and how I think most New Orleanians think about it is like a quick way to make a buck, right? There's something deeper there. And then I started doing historical research. And actually, I did this research years ago at the Historic New Orleans collection. And what I learned is that there was this great there was this great civil rights battle in the 1940s, this post-war fight involving the Flambeau. And it happened during the carnival season of 1946. This was the first carnival to occur after, I believe, there were 5 years that were canceled during World War II. And so this is just carnival season is happening just 6 months after, the end of the war. And so the city is definitely excited, is geared up, and Momus is going to be the first parade to march with Flambeaux. And what happens is, just moments before the floats are to roll out of the den, there's a wage dispute. And there's a wage dispute between Momus's organizers and a cohort of veteran Flambeau carriers, right? Mm-hmm. And, they struck, basically, right? They struck for higher pay. And the Flambeau carriers demanded $5 per parade, which was an increase from the $2 that they were being paid before the war. But it was a raise that they said they were guaranteed, they were promised. And what happened that night during the Momus parade is that the Flambeau did not march, and that the Momus parade had to kind of recruit white men to carry the torches that night. And traditionally, historically, and this is going back to the pre-modern Mardi Gras, so before organized parades, before 1850s, even these unorganized parades that happened in early New Orleans carnival seasons, had flambeaux, which were both, they were men, black men, forcibly conscripted, right? Or, post-emancipation, paid to light the streets of a city, either without lighting at the time or with shoddy lighting, right? And this tradition carried on throughout the 20th century. These were black men, and so when these black men they fought for more pay. They saw themselves as a major part of the parades and of the parading tradition, and they thought that the parades wouldn't be the same without them, and they were right, because several of the parades later that carnival season were forced to march in the dark without the benefit of these, of the fire and the torches. And so they eventually, they got their raise. There was another wage dispute a few years later and another strike. And, over time, that wage generally increases. Today, the Flambeau carriers make upwards of $60 or $80 plus tips, and plus tips means they can make hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And when I spoke to the men, when I kind of did these interviews with the men, with the veterans I was talking to, they knew about this history, right? This was not, they didn't know all the details, but they knew that their forebears had struck for better pay, for better working conditions decades earlier.
But the thing about flambeau carriers is they still exist. Like, we have street lights now. Most parades have LED lights on them. Are they some sort of vestigial remnant of carnival tradition? Obviously, as we've talked, carnival is capable of change, drastic change.
Yeah.
But also in some ways not.
Yeah. This is complicated, to say the least. And there's plenty of voices in the local Black community that say that this is no good, right? That this is just like a continuation of a racist practice, right? And as something harking back to slavery, when men were forced to carry torches for white parading groups. One leading voice calls it carrying the torch of oppression. And I asked the veteran Flambeau carriers about this, and they are doing the work, they are marching, and they also see, they see what they do as important. They see what they do as a larger part of the carnival tradition. They see what they do as something that they want to introduce kids to, right? To young men and women to carrying this torch. They also see it as fun, it is also a way to make some money, to be truthful. And a lot of them told me stories of buying school uniforms for their kids and throwing big parties on Mardi Gras Day with, they're able to buy all the food and drink with the hundreds of dollars they make by marching in several parades. So it is a literal passing of the torch. It is a tradition that is also complicated. And like a lot of the traditions, a lot of the history I'm talking about today, we have to remind ourselves that we need to continually talk about it and think about it and ask questions about it, and also kind of recognize the history behind it.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about Black Mardi Gras. We talked about women being out on the streets as baby dolls. There's lots of other civil rights movements out there. And one you wanted to talk about is gay carnival. And so how does that play into this narrative that you have made of unmaking Mardi Gras?
Yeah, so in the 1960s, almost at the century mark of modern carnival in New Orleans, another marginalized group were kind of re-envisioning Mardi Gras anew with their own civil rights struggle. And I think it's just worth mentioning kind of the longer history of this, but almost, from the very beginning, New Orleans has offered, has been a safe haven for sexual nonconformity, for LGBTQ plus individuals. And carnival is a big part of that. And Mardi Gras is a big part of that. One of the, we were talking about rite of reversal earlier, and one of the kind of premier rite of reversals, one of the most popular is of course cross-dressing, and that's cross-dressing has been popular in carnival celebrations way before New Orleans was ever a dot on the map. And the gay aesthetic that is carnival both in New Orleans and most everywhere else is obvious once you look at it with a queer eye. And when you consider the costumes and the pageantry and the sparkly befeathered costumes, the longing for a community, it's easy to see Mardi Gras for what I think it is, which is an annual celebration of queerness. And Mardi Gras is gay. I mean, it is emphatically gay, but it wasn't until the late 1960s, moving on, that gay Mardi Gras was able to be a little more public than what it was before, right? So, it certainly has changed since then, but what happens is that in the late 1950s, a group of men who they were regulars at a bar called Dixie's Bar. It was on Bourbon Street, and it was a gay-friendly bar and nightclub. They decided to form their own carnival crew, New Orleans' first openly gay carnival crew, and they called themselves the Krewe of Yuga, which was nominally a term from Hindu mythology. But continuing in the tradition of Comus and Momus and other kind of mythology embracing crews. But their name also more than likely hinted at a bunch of coded wordplay. Yuga was code perhaps for you gay, as in the question. Yuga is spelled Y-U-G-A, the crew. As a this question could be a sort of a secret handshake for gay men. Or to make sure they were allies, right? They were also the crew's initials, which we can all go figure out ourselves. But their first ball, they held a ball in 1958 at a private home, at a private residence on South Carrollton Avenue, which is now, if you're familiar with the area, it's now the home to the Mexican restaurant called Taco Loco. But anyway, they have an annual costume ball there. And what's really interesting and, kind of a really wonderful example of pushing back against, and unmaking carnival culture at the time is they decided to hold their ball during a parade that was marching down the street. And this was the Krewe of Carrollton's annual Mardi Gras parade. So they have this big costume ball in the home. They do it again the following year. Their numbers grow too big. They eventually need, more kind of private quarters and a bigger space. And So they move off of Carrollton Avenue and they kind of rent these kind of warehouse type rooms. And in 1962, something really important and awful happens. And this is the year of their 5th annual ball, and it's raided by the Jefferson Parish Police. This ball is being held just across the parish line, and it's raided by police forces, armed, mounted, assisted by a canine unit. The men at the ball that evening, they scatter, they jump from windows, they flee into nearby woods. 100 men were arrested, cuffed, fingerprinted, held for bail. They were bailed out from the till at Dixie's Bar. And many of the men of those 100 men who were arrested and booked and arrested, they lost their jobs because their names were printed in the local newspapers for being deviants, basically, which was the code word for the time. And what's really fascinating about this moment is that it takes place a full decade before the Stonewall riots. And these men kind of inspire an LGBTQ Mardi Gras movement, and many more organizations come online. The most famous and the biggest of which is the Krewe of Petronius, which despite further intolerance and oppression in the city and decimation of its membership during the AIDS crisis, survives to this day. And so I think what Yuga and all the other kind of examples I mentioned today is they, even for their faults or for their inner battles, like when we talked about the Krewe of Zulu in the 50s and 60s, they kind of showcased and illuminated the great promise of Mardi Gras, and that's its humanity and its fluidity, and that Carnival can and does and should offer progress. And as I said before, is always a chance to reimagine the world anew. And sometimes this doesn't work out. Every year there's a new Carnival controversy, and that's maybe just the way it should be, because through those controversies we always we hopefully push through and better find what Mardi Gras and Carnival in New Orleans should be.
Great. Yeah, this the way that we have been speaking about the first century of Carnival, I feel is different than the way the first century of Carnival has been presented by white historians in New Orleans for generations and generations. But I think it brings up all of these themes of Carnival, that it's not just the shallow party that we have in our city every year. It reflects broader historical contexts and cultural contexts, and it's not a straight line. I mean, we bounced all over the place in this first century of Carnival history. So thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.